Okay, let's just do this. All right, so you heard the question, why take this class on atheism? Anybody else have an answer to that? You know, why are you here this morning?
Well, I can never have enough tools in my toolbox.
All right.
And I've listened to one of those Lighthouse Catholic medias about it. But
Okay.
then when you're trying to think back of it, I always wonder, will I know what to ask and what to say? But I have heard enough times, so I've learned that you start by asking questions. Why do you think that? And
Very good.
you know, explain that. But then I might hit a brick wall. So I don't know.
Yeah.
More tools in my toolbox.
Very good. Okay, anyone else? Yeah, Bridget?
Yeah, I just feel like I need confidence to be able to talk to, in particular, my children,
Okay.
their beliefs. And I don't have that confidence in myself. I feel like they're going to hit me with things that I'm going to get flustered and not even know how to respond.
Yeah, that's why asking questions to seek to understand kind of gets you out of that position, right? And then you actually, it has the advantage of giving you some knowledge about what exactly you're dealing with, okay? Anyone else? Tom, you here to agitate me or learn something? You can unmute yourself. Still can't hear you. You're not unmuted yet, Tom. There you go.
Yeah, I'm here to learn something.
Oh, okay. You're not here to harass me.
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay.
But I'm flexible.
Okay. Yes, Lynn. Yeah, you got to unmute yourself.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
You know, two people in my family are so scientifically oriented that when I ever talk to them about it, it's always, there's no proof that God exists.
We're going to talk about that today.
Good. Thank you.
We're going to talk about that today. And if all goes well and the Holy Spirit is working strong within me, I'll have a class this fall to help you even further with that. All right. George, you got a reason for being here, or are you just curious? Whoop, you got to unmute. There you go.
Yeah, I'm like Bridget. I like to be able to share information with my daughter. We have one child, our daughter, and we have two grandchildren. So I'm kind of the same way.
Okay. All right. Very good. I see Dr. Moorhart's on the line. Is that you?
Yes, it is.
Hey, good morning. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Very good. Got a good reason for being here or just a reason?
Oh, I don't know if it's a good reason, but it is a reason.
Yeah. So what's your reason for being here, Mark?
I think the same, similar to what Bridget talked about. I mean, where you're, to me, the reality of people you deal with in the world every day is that the non-belief is becoming more common than belief. And
Yes.
so, particularly if you're under a particular age.
Yes.
And so to talk to people of that particular age group, you can never know too much.
That is correct. That's correct. That's correct. All right. Anyone else? I see we got William Riley, Carol, Vi. Any of you have some input to that question? Vi.
So thus far, for all the reasons that have been stated, I've actually taken this class before and it's been very, very helpful. So another reason is to refresh myself and probably to glean more, because it's other people's input is always so valuable. And Deacon Mark, you might have some new material. But yes, for definitely all the reasons, I do have some very close family members who are very scientific, like Lynn said. Just in all sincerity, for all the reasons that have been stated thus far, they've all been well stated. and I have the same concerns.
Okay, so, and I'll reiterate this, the more I hear this, the more I'm convinced I need to do this in the fall. So I have a follow-on class. It's probably going to be 10 or 12 weeks in length. And it gets into far more detail than we can in the time that we have here, for this class. So as good as this class and Terry's is, there's a lot more that we can talk about, and it would take multiple weeks. So we're planning that class now. So look to that be start up sometime this fall, 10 to 12 weeks. All right. All right. If no one else has anything, I think I want to get started. How's that? Everybody good with that? Okay, good. So this class and Christian apologetics generally is especially needed today because the world is facing three crises, all right? The first is Western civilization is for the first time in its history in danger of dying. And the reason is spiritual, because Western civilization is losing its life, its very soul, and that soul was the Christian faith. And the infection that is killing us is the secularism of no faith and no soul. Okay? Whoops, hold on here. Here we go. And then second, we are not only in a civil cultural crisis, we're having a problem here.
It's very jumpy. You just gotta kind of get the hang of it. Go back again.
Hey, why is it doing that? Hold
I
on.
think if you do the arrow at the bottom.
Oh, right here?
Yeah.
Okay. But
It's just very sensitive.
okay. I'm sorry, guys. I'm still trying to get this worked out. So secondly, we're not only in a civil cultural crisis, but we also find ourselves in a philosophical and intellectual crisis. So our crisis is a crisis of truth, where we increasingly find the very idea of objective truth being ignored or abandoned or attacked. And finally, as bad as those things may be, the deepest level of our crisis is not cultural or intellectual, it is spiritual. So at stake are the internal souls of all men and women for whom Christ died. And we know with certainty that with each and every passing day, we and every individual ever born is nearing death and eternal judgment. Our civilization may last for another century, but you and I and everyone else will stand naked in the light of God. We better learn to love and seek that light of God's truth and love while there's still time, so that it will be our joy and not our fear for all eternity. It is quite unfashionable today to speak of such things, but it speaks volumes about the spiritual insanity of our age. Now, the reason for this specific class on atheism is that we need a rational explanation for believing what we do as Catholics in a world that is becoming aggressively and unashamedly secular. And this material Terry and I are about to present will help you gain an appreciation for the dialogue that has to happen between believers and people that are struggling with belief. So in this class, we'll talk about things that might be useful in those conversations. Although some of what we will present is in the form of argument, the most important thing when sharing our faith is our charity and our witness of love for the person in front of us. In other words, though arguments are a type of rhetorical weapon, they are more like swords than bombs. Bombs are rather indiscriminate in their targets. It matters little who drops a bomb, but it matters enormously who wields a sword, for a sword is an extension of the swordsman. Thus, an argument in apologetics, when actually used in dialogue, is an extension of the one who argues. It's an extension of you. So your tone, your sincerity, your care, your concern, and listening and respect matter as much as your logic, probably more. The world was won for Christ not by arguments, but by sanctity. So with that, let's begin in the prayer. Let's begin with the prayer. In the name of the Father and of the Son and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Heavenly Father, in whom we live, move, and have our being, we give you thanks and praise for the gift of who you are and who you have made us to be, human beings on a journey to come to know your love for us. We ask that you be with us this day, that you bless our time and make it fruitful, and to be especially with those people that we care about the most, wherever they may be, especially if they're far from you. Let us now pray to our Mother to be especially close to us at this time. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou amongst women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. All right, we have 3 objectives today for our time together. All right, the first objective, we'll be able to give, whoops, you didn't share the screen? Whoops. Where?
Right there, green. And go up there. That one, yeah.
This one?
No, down under it. Right there. Yeah. That's it. And then hit share on the bottom.
Oh, there we go. You guys got it now? Perfect. All right, we're good, right? So our first objective is to be able to give an answer to why the question of God's existence matters. That may seem very self-evident to us, but it's worth reflecting on why that topic matters. All right? Our second is to be able to define the philosophy of reductionism. Big word, but it'll make sense in a few minutes. And then third, to be able to identify different forms of reductionism that atheists or agnostics use in their arguments. And as we go through the class, we'll address some of those arguments. One very important thing we must realize is that philosophy is critical to any conversation about God's existence. So what is philosophy? Anybody have an answer to that? What is philosophy? Quick answer. Anybody? Anybody want to take a stab at what's philosophy? Oh, cowards, come on. Somebody needs to step out. What's philosophy? All right, I'm going to be easy on you. Here we go. Philosophy is the study of human experience through the use of reason, okay? So one of the biggest contentions in our modern culture about God's existence is this alleged conflict between science and religion. Now, I say alleged because those two things are meant to go together, not conflict. The alleged conflict has arisen because we've lost the mitigating discipline of philosophy. Once philosophy disappeared from our common vocabulary, the door opened to a lot of confusion between science and religion. This gets back to Mark's earlier comment about talking to this generation. You know, philosophy is hardly ever taught in our universities, much less required, and particularly even at the high school level. So people who don't have any formation in philosophy, particularly the young people today, are easily swayed by some of the things they hear. There are those who call themselves atheists or agnostics who are very good evangelists for atheism and agnosticism. Just to see how good they are, just do a YouTube search on atheism and watch some of the videos that come up. They're short, they're catchy, they're visually appealing, and they are quite persuasive. And if you, after this class, if you really want to see some advanced apologetics with atheism, go on YouTube, do a search for Bishop Barron, B-A-R-R-O-N, and he goes out and debates atheists all the time, and you'll see those on YouTube. You should catch those, okay, because he is quite good, all right? Peter Kreeft said this about the shortcomings in atheistic philosophy. Philosophy in our century is seldom both clear and profound, or respectful of reason and respectful of mystery at the same time. So if we cannot readily address the atheist's highly persuasive arguments, we will continue to lose ground, and more importantly, we will lose souls. So the first step in our preparation is for us to get modestly comfortable with philosophy, specifically to look at one of the most important tools of modern atheism, and it's called reductionism. We will define the meaning of reductionism and how to identify it when it is being used, because it is used quite often, and this knowledge will equip us for a number of conversations we might have with people. Now, here in this class, and classroom instruction in general, teaching comes down to giving people the proper or correct words to use because it helps us categorize our thinking. The more words we have, the more precise we can be when we speak with others. So we'll be learning some important terminology today as well. I recently read a very fascinating article, and it was very lengthy, but it was about what it means to be pastoral to someone. And one of the themes throughout the entire article was precision in language. And this is the first time I've ever seen anyone really come out and say that. So for us to love others, the precision that we use, with which we use words correctly, is very important in how pastoral, how charitable we are to them. So before we go further, let's do a little work. Okay, I want you to answer this question. I'm going to give you about 3 minutes. All right. Why does God's existence matter to you? All right, go. You got 3 minutes. Doing their classwork. We're going to give extra credit to whoever volunteers to answer first.
Hey, when we're finished with this question, can I say something about the whole philosophy?
Sure. Matter of fact, you can start now. Let's go ahead and finish early.
Okay.
All right. Go ahead.
Which part? My question or the philosophy?
You do the philosophy, then we'll take on the question.
All right. This seldom both clear, profound, or respectful of reason. This is my son who has almost a minor in philosophy, is the one who's agnostic. And it was philosophy that brought him. It's only because he went to school, the philosophy and religion department didn't like each other. So there was always a problem with that, which was so sad because I believe they go well together. But I think this definition of both seldom clear, profound, or respectful of reason might be the reason why.
Well, respectful of mystery too at the same time, right? So we'll get into that a little bit. Okay, who wants to answer the question, why does God's existence matter to you?
I will.
All right, go ahead, Teresa.
I said because I'm afraid of the unknown, because I'm afraid of dying. I want to know I'm going to heaven, because it makes everything right in the world. In other words, it gives suffering meaning, and inequality is okay because it'll all be equalized by God in the end.
Okay, very good. Bridget, you had your hand up.
I just put it up because I figured all my ideas would be used quickly.
Teresa, go ahead.
For me, the existence of God matters because it puts a reason and a purpose to my life.
Okay, very good. Okay. Anyone else? Yes, Lynn.
Well, you know, I was in the medical field, and knowing how intricately we're made and how we're perfectly formed, and we don't even understand how things work within us, this cannot be random. And, you know, I think that, of course, we're made in God's likeness and image, and we're put here for a purpose. And I really want to know, you know, as we go along in life, I try to find out why God has placed me in different situations to know what to do. And I don't want to miss that purpose and fulfill it. And I know that we're only here for a short time and that our home is eternal life. So that's
Okay.
what I believe.
All right, Angie.
It matters because he is the essence of all that has to do with existence. He created us, and to me, nothing makes sense without him. And like love, you can't see it, but you feel it. And so God is like, it is God. God is love. And so therefore, it's something that you just know. And he's always constant and consistent. So he's the only thing that no matter what goes on in life, always remains consistent and constant in his love for us. So that's very comforting, especially when we deal with all the things that we have to deal with in life.
Yeah, so hold that thought on love. That's a very profound thought, which we'll take up a little bit later. Okay.
Okay.
All right. Anyone else? Okay, so here are some questions, right? And I think you guys pretty much touched on all of these. You know, is there an afterlife? Yeah, how should I live my life today, right? Is there meaning to suffering? Is there a human soul? If God does exist, can I even know God? Can I communicate with God? Has God tried to communicate with me, right? Right. So is there any meaning at all to this life beyond what I think and perceive? And then why am I here at all? Now, all of these questions are profoundly human, and they deserve to be asked. People have the right to hear all possible answers to those questions. That is a fundamental human right, to get to ask these kinds of questions. So this particular topic is of great importance for people who want to share the faith, because these questions give us immediate common ground with anybody, particularly the question on suffering. Because if suffering hasn't already impacted a person's life yet, it's just a matter of time before it does. So this question and the others are deeply meaningful. When people experience suffering, it is an opening to ask some of the questions they have previously not thought to ask. It may be just being patient until those things happen. And then, when those things happen, but not in an opportunistic way, but in a real loving way, to find yourself with that person face to face and say, where is God in this for us? These are important questions. This is why this question matters so much. And our first step to get modestly comfortable with philosophy, we need to introduce ourselves to the philosophy behind how we know things. The first thing I want to do is give you a little deeper introduction to the philosophy of how we know, okay? So up on the screen is our earlier definition of the word philosophy with a bit more detail. So philosophy is the study of human experience through the use of reason, usually with the classical branches of metaphysics, ethics, epistemology, and logic. So let's read that again. The study of human experience through the use of reason, usually with metaphysics, ethics, and epistemology. It's the study of human experience through the use of reason. So what do I mean by reason? All right. Reason, properly understood, all right, is not confined to reasoning, okay, calculating, what scholastics call the third act of the mind, right? It also includes the first act of the mind, which consists of apprehension. And I put definitions up there because there's some ambiguity around these words. We kind of use them interchangeable when in fact they're not. So reason is where we use apprehension to grasp something mentally. Intellectual intuition is the faculty of knowing without proof. Understanding is aware of the nature and significance of something. Insight is discerning the true nature of a situation in contemplation, which is thoughtful observation or study, okay? That's reason properly understood, okay? When the average person hears philosophy, they think it matters only to those people in universities who use it for a living or use it poorly for a reason, or for a living, as Angie pointed out. But it's the study of human experience. In other words, any human that's ever experienced anything and reflected on it is already in the process of doing philosophy. If you ask yourself, why do people do something? You're engaging in philosophy. Philosophy is a human thing. It is a very deeply human thing. Perhaps this is already obvious to us, but if someone says, philosophy, who needs it? I only need to understand practical things. That's a philosophy, whether they realize it or not, because philosophy is a part of what it means to be human. All right? We experience things and we think about them. Now, we could distract ourselves from thinking about our experiences, maybe, but that's a philosophical choice as well. We can't get around this, which is why it's so important to talk about it. To talk about philosophy effectively, we need to develop our vocabulary, and there are some words that we need to begin with. But before I go to those words, I want to point out to the slide, faith and reason, which many will tell us are in conflict, are in fact allies. Faith can never contradict reason when reason is properly used, right? But faith goes beyond reason. So not only does faith not contradict reason, but reason leads to faith, discovers clues to faith, and provides good reasons for faith, right? There's one God who's the source of all truth, whether that truth is known by faith or reason, and God never contradicts himself, all right? And something that we'll start touching on today is every argument against the true faith, every objection to the faith makes some mistake in the use of reason. It either misunderstands the meaning of some terms or assumes some false premise or makes some mistake in reasoning, some logical error. This gets back to, it talks about meaning of some terms. What's important is this is where precision in language is important. That if you're going to have a discussion with someone who's a hardcore atheist, the first thing you got to do is agree to your definition of terms, or you may be just talking right past each other. Okay? So terms is very important. All right, here are the branches of philosophy I mentioned before that come into how we know. The first is metaphysics. It's the study of being, of anything that is. So metaphysics is the study of being. Our next field is ethics. It's the study of how we should behave. Ethics is about morality. The question of, does God say anything about how I should behave? The next one's a big word, epistemology. It's probably an unfamiliar word for most of you, and it means the study of how we know. The study of how we know things, right? And then finally, logic is the art of reasoning, how we reason. Some of us may have had classes in logic at some stage in our life. Unfortunately, not enough of us, and certainly not enough of our youth. Epistemology, the study of how we know, is foundational to everything we do. And most of the problems we have with atheists and atheism in our culture revolve around how we know things. Many of their objections can be answered simply if we have a basic understanding of epistemology, the study of how we know things. So how do we know things? We know truth in three basic ways. All right, before I pop the slide, how do we know? What are the three ways that we know things? Somebody want to take a stab at this? How do we?
Through our senses.
All right, very good. Senses, what else?
Experience.
Experience, very good. There's one more.
Visual.
No, that's the senses.
Okay, oh, that's true.
Hearing about it from other people.
Testimony, very good. Hey, Terry, this is a smart class. Okay, the first way, right, is through logic, all right? We can use our natural human reason to deduce other truths from the things we already know. So imagine, for example, the things we already know, all right? If I know that Socrates was a man, and if I know that all men are mortal, then I can know with certainty that Socrates was mortal. That's useful because we didn't have to do any forensic investigation. We didn't have to go dig up Socrates' grave to make sure he was mortal. We did that through logic. And I don't think anyone here has met Socrates, and I don't think anyone's been to Greece to check his grave, but we know that because we're logical people. Mathematics is a field of study that resides in the realm of logic. The whole art of making logical arguments is from this area. This is where philosophy really lives. When people are doing any kind of philosophy, it's usually the use of logic that they're doing. That's the first way we can know. So it's logic, all right? So if we know Socrates is a man and if all men are mortal, then Socrates was immortal. See, we don't have to go investigate. We're using logic. The second way we know is through our experience and observation, right? So this is our senses, like Carol said. We can use all five of our senses, sight, touch, smell, taste, sound, what we hear, to observe the world around us, right? And we can also make psychological observations about ourselves and how we feel about things. In its purest form, the scientific method in modern science lives here in this form of knowledge. It's where you go out and study things, right? I can also observe my own experiences. If there are situations that make me happy or make me feel uncomfortable, I can make observations about those situations interiorly about myself. So it's not just physical things that can be observed, right? And the third way we know is through the testimony of others. We can be told things by other people we trust, right? This is vital and practical because, quite frankly, it would be difficult to experience everything in the world. At some point, I have to rely on the words of others to report what they know. As an example, the study of history requires the testimony of others. Another example is Amazon product reviews. How many people have used those? Raise your hand. Everybody's used Amazon product reviews, right? Right? So we're relying on other people's testimony about a particular product. What's another example of testimony? What's another where you rely on testimony?
Teaching, listen to teachers.
Yeah. But what's a particular piece of information that you rely on testimony, right?
The past.
The Bible.
Yeah, the Bible's a form of testimony, right?
People's spiritual testimonies.
Spiritual, right? But, here's a practical one. So how many of us have been to Canberra, Australia? Okay, but you all know it exists, right? Right. That's testimony because somebody's been there, right? So as human beings, we need all three. Most of us use all three of these forms of information all the time. These three things are particularly important because the church tells us we can use all three to learn about God. The church says you can use logic and reason to figure out that God exists. The proofs of God's existence come from these forms of knowledge. Specifically, they come from the first form of knowledge, which is from logic. Who has heard St. Thomas Aquinas' first 5 proofs for God's existence? Everybody familiar with that? Anybody? Wow. Or Aristotle's first mover or first cause? Okay. We don't have time to go through those here, but you can look those up and probably Google those things and talk about Aquinas' first 5 proofs for God's existence. These are all efforts human beings have made throughout history to use logic to figure out that there are some things that we can see and we can reason from to show that there must be a God. However, the church also says we are not locked into just logic. We can also experience God directly. Many of you have probably had experiences of God, things that happen in your life, and you can say, my life was never the same after that. Maybe it was a retreat, maybe it was a homily, maybe it was a class, maybe it was some tragedy. But something happened and something broke through and you knew there's a God. You knew that something spoke to you. It's very hard to communicate that. You can't prove that logically, but you know it because you experienced it. So the best thing one could say to an atheist is, would you like to experience it? Come with me. Don't ever forget that. If you've got someone in your life that doesn't believe in God, invite them to an adoration chapel with you. Even if it sounds crazy, invite them to go. You never know what might happen if the person is open to it. God does amazing things. The third thing you can do is hear about God from the testimony of others. This is really basic, but it's obvious that in Christianity, this is how the whole thing worked. Jesus came, he recruited 12 buddies, 11 of whom abandoned him when he died, except for the one who also ran off and then came back to watch the crucifixion, right? Nevertheless, those 12, as well as several hundred others, were told in Paul's letters to the Corinthians, that they all saw the risen Jesus, and then they went out to the world and said, we've seen something. In other words, they gave their testimony. They gave their testimony of how they experienced God, and they were willing to die for it. They didn't die rich. They certainly didn't die popular. They died poor and destitute for the first 300 years. In fact, for the first 300 years, the majority of popes were all martyrs. This is an important detail about the church's history to keep in your back pocket because people sometimes say the church has always been corrupt. Now, admittedly, we have a lot of corruption in our church. No one's going to argue that. But the first 300 years, if you were a pope, it was like a death sentence. So you weren't signing up for being a pope for getting rich or getting powerful. History, it is a good thing to know. The point is, you can know things and you can know God from the testimony of others. I want you to take a moment and I want you to think about these 3 ways of knowing. Okay, what's the first one? Logic, right? Then you got testimony, and then you have what? Your senses, all right? Okay. We got some classwork. I want you to take a few moments, and if you can, think of any times that you experience God through one of these 3 means, logic, experience, and testimony. I want you to write them down next to it. So you put on your paper logic, experience, testimony, and next to each one of those, if you can, write down a time when you experienced God through logic, through an experience, or through testimony. I'll give you about 3 minutes. Okay, I'm going to go first. All right, I'm going to break the ice. How's that? All right. So my experience of God is actually through logic and testimony at the same time. So my journey back to the church as a young man began with reading Scott Hahn's earlier works, how he became Catholic, and the logics involved in how he studied scripture and was able to logically put it together that the Catholic Church is the one true church. And so it was through that logic and through his testimony of his conversion, right, that had a huge impact on me, right, and draw me back into the church and closer to God, right? So it was an experience of God through his writings, his logic. All right. Who wants to go next? Bridget.
Most recently, I experienced full knowledge of God's existence by being with my mother and witnessing her death.
Okay.
And then, especially in the final moments when she had not been conversant for almost 2 days. And I started talking to her about her passing, and it was a lot of things going on, but at that moment she opened her eyes to all of her children and grandchildren present before she passed away. And I know God, that experience of sensual, the senses and
Right.
the emotion. Yeah.
Very experiential. Yeah, those are very powerful. Thanks for sharing that, by the way. Anyone else?
I also had that experience with my dad when he was in hospice. He had not had anything to eat or drink for over a week, and yet he had the energy to reach out to my mom several times, just puckering up for a kiss. I saw the love that they shared for 68 years. And he was not verbal, but he communicated through his eyes. And also I was aware of him being aware of other beings in the room. They talk about people from heaven or wherever coming back, and that the person who's dying sees them. And he was constantly looking in different areas of the room, and he just appeared to be seeing someone. And
Yeah.
my mom had the same experience. She kept asking me where her parents went when she was in and out of consciousness. And I believe that she was seeing them as she was making her transition into the afterlife.
So another one of those wonderful experiences of God, right? And one of the most important moments in our lives, right?
Yes.
William, is that William? You got your hand up? Is that what that means?
Me, yes, sir.
Hey.
My first was looking in the eyes of a child, the innocence of a child, shows me God's existence, God's love. But you also mentioned the death experience. I was traveling, that was about 10 years ago. My father was dying. I was in South Africa. And I was at the airport. My brothers called me to tell me Dad wasn't going to last the night. And I'm on the airplane and I'm watching a movie. And it was one of those apocalyptic movies. And there was a scene in there with the father and son. And the next thing, and about 10 minutes later, my screen goes blank. And I tried to get the flight attendants to restart it. But I just knew at that time, I looked at my watch, and that for the next 12 hours on this flight, I was, I had nothing to listen to other than to sit there and to contemplate what was happening. And I knew my father passed. And my sister had the same exact experience. She was flying home she was flying to Maryland from Texas. And she was on the plane, and at that time, she felt a presence in the sky looking out at the clouds. And at that exact time was the moment my father passed. So I knew God existed then. And it was a very emotional experience, and it brought me closer to my faith.
Yeah.
And then testimony is basically when you do hear people's stories who are non-believers and become believers due to something like that, and their testimony. Of course, the Bible, the readings and the stories in the Bible is also a testimony. And I'm not sure how logic comes into play in that. Maybe you can expand a little bit more on it.
Yeah, well, yeah, all right. Anyone else? Angie, go ahead.
My mother wasn't supposed to have children, and so logically she should not have had children at all. And she got pregnant, waited till she was 4 months to go to the doctor. The doctor said she might not live through it. So I was 8 months. She was in an oxygen tent. I should have passed then. I should have passed when I got high altitude sickness and in a car accident. And so my testimony is that God had a plan for my mom to be a mom and for me to be here. And I know he exists because I shouldn't have been here in the first place. And here I am at 65, just turned. So that's why I'm pro-life. And that's my testimony. And that's the testimony I use for why I'm pro-life. It's my mother.
Of course, atheists will argue that's random chance, but we'll talk about all that. Lynn, did you have something?
Yes. I was going to talk about the logic side, I think. Well, first of all, the experience side. When I was a child, I just knew through nature. I was very close to nature, so I always felt God's presence, even if I didn't know who he was at that time. I just always felt that power. And then back in the day, before the Catholic Church ever really did Bible studies, I lived in Mobile, Alabama, and I went to a Baptist church for a Bible study on Romans. That was an experience in itself, but I immersed myself in the book of Romans and then would study at home. And I felt an incredible experience of grace upon me through that whole time. And then it's funny how God works. And when it was finished and it was almost like God lifts the grace, then you realize what you were in, like the state of grace you were in while I was studying the Bible. So that was really something special. And yeah, so those are like two examples.
Very good. Thank you. Teresa?
Glenn and I are doing a thing where our kids are asking us questions and we're writing the answers to it for posterity. And one of them was, have you lost your faith? And I told the story that when I was a kid, I had a year-long calendar, and I decided I want to know if there was a God. So I opened the calendar randomly and circled a page and said, if it rains on this day, there's a God. And it was the first day of summer vacation at the beach, and it poured all day long. And so that, I mean, as a kid, that was pretty impressive to me. But and then also Jesus was a real person in history. So that plus, like you said, the apostles and the first popes all being martyred and parents sending their kids to the lions, that to me, you know, those two facts together prove it. But then my experience, our daughter almost died from having a baby, and she was in critical condition and for 31 days near death. And I was taking care of the new baby, and I was just crying to God and saying, I don't know whether to prepare for our daughter to die, and how are we going to raise this baby? How are we going to stay in touch with our son-in-law, et cetera, et cetera. God, please tell me what I should be preparing for and if she's going to live or not. And the baby looked up at me and laughed. She was only like 3 weeks old. So that was my hint. And our daughter lived, and our granddaughter just turned 12 last week.
Yeah. I always knew God has a wicked sense of humor. Anyone else? All right. Those are all great answers, by the way. All right, let's go. Now, we're going to tie this all together, and we're going to start by this big word, reductionism. All right, this is the atheist's primary tool. This is the hammer with which they approach most of the arguments. So at the root of the word is the word reduction, right? Which means to reduce something complex down to something incredibly simple. Usually it's something that really needs to be complex. It means the philosophical tendency of some to simplify a complex phenomenon down to just one of its elements, like, for instance, the three ways of knowing, right? Logic, sense experience, and testimony. So one of the moves typical of atheism today is to hone in on one of these three ways of knowing and use it exclusively. Which one do you think they do? Which is the one way of knowing that the atheists always use?
Logic.
Logic.
No, experience. Sense experience, okay? Not logic, right? And you'll see, all right?
The scientific method falls under that.
Yeah, that's right. So it's sense experience because modern atheism is obsessed with science. This is why you hear atheists say things like, prove it to me. I need to run an experiment. I want to see evidence for God's existence. Who's heard that before? Sure, you've all heard that before, right? So where is the experiment? There's actually a quote from an astronaut who, when we launched him into space, famously said, I've been to the heavens and there is no God. I didn't see him there, which is kind of ironic. How could you look at all that and not think of God? But at any rate, what he's saying is this, basically, I saw no physical evidence of him, even though it was right there in front of him. This is the reductionism of modern atheism. It's where they say the only kind of knowledge I'm going to accept is the stuff of sense experience. That's reductionism, and it's specifically a reduction down to the scientific level, okay? So, here's some little bit of classwork, right? Write down a Catholic response to this statement. If I can't see it, I don't believe it. So if I come up to you or someone will come up to you and says, if I can't see it, I don't believe it, how do you respond? Go, you got about a minute. We'll go to the break. Okay. Who's got a snappy answer? I'm looking for it. Yeah, Lynn, you got a snappy answer? You got to unmute yourself.
I don't know if it's snappy, but I would say to the person, do you see the love that you feel between you and your family member, your child, your husband? Do you see that?
Very good. Outstanding answer. Teresa.
I would say, how can you prove to me there is no God? What's your logic and your, what can you see that tells me there is no God?
And that's actually pretty good. We got a different way of asking that questions, but yes, that's good. Anyone else? Angie.
Air, you can't see it, but you can feel it. You're breathing it, so you're alive.
There you go. Okay. What else? Well, if you're going to use air, you might as well talk about gravity. Right? Okay. So if someone said, I only believe in senses, they may actually be cutting out things like love. Why? Why? Because they can't prove love scientifically. What's the experiment? Justice works the same way because justice is an abstract concept, one that most of us care deeply about justice. What about mercy? What about compassion? How do you measure those things? How do you weigh them in a scale? What's the experiment to prove compassion exists? When we point out things like love and justice, what we are doing is showing the reductionists that if they were to truly live their life by senses only, they could not live it consistently because to only believe in things that can be measured is an extremely narrow understanding of the world. It's not an accurate or complete understanding of the world. Can you see how our responses are pushing back on reductionism? In effect, we are being quite logical by saying, okay, if you believe that, then why this, that, and the other? Why would you believe in, for example, justice if you can't measure that? Here's another response. It's a little sophisticated, but it's worth knowing. What's wrong with the statement, I only believe what science can prove? What's wrong with that? The problem with this statement is it's not provable by science. The phrase, I only believe what science can prove, or I only believe what I can see, are not provable by science. They are statements of philosophy. And in what realm does philosophy live? In the realm of logic. There is no scientific experiment proving that science is the only way by which we come to believe or know something. We will never find this statement in a test tube or in a chemical reaction because you can't measure this statement with scientific experiments. This statement is a statement of philosophy and it is self-refuting. It's that simple. The second someone says, I only believe what science can prove, you can respond, that's interesting. What scientific experiment did you use to come up with that? And then don't say a word. Remember, you're not there to argue. So
Mark, another thing I'd like to say is that science is always evolving. And maybe the experiment that proves it hasn't been developed yet. They've used experiments on the Shroud of Turin back 30 years ago. And more recently, they have some new experiments that actually prove the date of the shroud. And that was in question 30 years ago.
Okay, but while that may be true, right? Are you going to rest your current belief on something that hasn't been developed?
Right.
Right?
Right.
I mean, that's what you're making the statement, I only believe what science can prove. So I could say prove today, right? Well, you're still in the same box. What scientific experiment did you use to come up with that? Right? Still in the same box. And I'm pretty sure it's not scientific. And if it's not scientific, you just contradicted your very statement, right? So now, to be honest, to your point, this response is not likely to make some believe in God. And if they're really stubborn, they'll respond with, so what? They'll just move on. However, what you have done is planted the seed in their mind that they're actually doing something illogical, right? And nothing drives an atheist nuts than realizing they're being illogical, all right? You're forcing them to think that they're actually saying something that they're not actually living out, okay? So now they're caught in two contradictions already. They're being inconsistent. And that's an important thing to be able to point out, to plant that seed, right? But you do it by asking a question. Ultimately, when someone reduces everything to one thing, it's actually not very livable. So if you're in a dialogue with someone who believes in the supremacy of science, the art of apologetics is to charitably point out that inconsistency. The whole thing of being able to show someone the inconsistency in what they're saying is the art of apologetics. It's an art, right? You have to that person has to trust that you're having this conversation in their best interest and that you're just not trying to crush them. That's the art of apologetics. We say it's art because you're not trying to have a knockdown, drag-out fight. It never works anyway. We must use love when pointing out these inconsistencies because their emotional walls may already be up, right? And if you attack them, no, they just build them higher. So they may not be ready to hear it, or when they hear it, they might not fight against it, or they might not just want to accept it, even though they know what you say is true. It's a human thing, and it's messy. But this is a good way to help them move past reductionism. Another similar statement is when someone says, there are no truths. But yet that statement itself is saying that it is a true statement, right? So therefore, it refutes itself. Moral relativism is all the rage these days, even though many don't realize it's self-refuting. Moral relativism basically proposes there's no such thing as one truth. And we could respond, really? It sounds like you just said one thing that was a truth, which means you're being illogical. I'm not trying to be annoying, but that doesn't make sense. So succinctly put, moral relativism states this. You might want to write this down. It is true for everybody that nothing is true for everybody. It is true for everybody that nothing is true for everybody. Does everyone see how that is self-refuting? The critical point here is that we are not there to win the argument. Actually, in some cases, our objective is to achieve a stalemate. What you want to do when someone wants to play the game, I'm just going to use logic, I'm just using science, is to put some new ideas into the game that hopefully help them realize I can't settle the issue with just my usual argument. Maybe there are other ways. Maybe I have to start looking at the question of God. Now you've helped them move a little bit beyond reductionism to possible other dialogues. You have removed some obstacles and opened up a heart that might be receptive to God. Now I realize I've made this seem easier than it may be, right? But with a little bit of knowledge and some study, you can do this. And if this is the first time you've heard these things, it's quite okay to feel uncomfortable with it. Studying it is part of what we have to do as well as practicing it. It's important because perhaps you'll have an opportunity to share this with someone, planting the seed that perhaps flowers into a little bit of knowledge and love of God. Okay? So what I ask you to do going forward as you have discussions with those you know who are atheists, those who doubt, okay, right? Think about how they might be throwing a reductionist argument at you, okay? Now, I think, yes, 5-minute break. So go ahead and I'm gonna stop my video because I'm gonna switch to the seated position here while you take a break. I think we're ready to start. Is everybody back? I guess so. All right, let's go ahead and get started. All right, so now we're going to get some practice recognizing reductionism, and we'll start with an example that's on the screen, okay? And before we begin, one of the hardest things to do with adult students is to make the classroom a place where it's okay to be wrong. But it's really critical that we do that. In fact, no real learning happens when we have this fear of being wrong, because if I can't be wrong publicly, then the teacher can't help me. And if the teacher can't help me, I can't grow as fast as I might. So I recognize by doing this particular activity, it might actually push us beyond where we're comfortable, but that's how we grow. Okay, so with that, all right, we're going to go through this example real quick, okay? Our culture loves to boil down all knowledge to just that of our sense experience and only ever accepts people's testimony if they are backed up by science. So this is a reduction in our sources of knowledge. Okay? So they're saying is science is the only source of knowledge. There's nothing wrong with scientific knowledge. However, the problem becomes when we fall into scientism. And I've actually preached on this before, thinking that only science can give me reliable knowledge. Again, it's not that there's anything wrong with science, but rather science alone is too narrow to account for all of our human experiences, like we mentioned before, like love, compassion, justice, and those types of things. Science simply cannot account for those things. All right. Did that help you, that example there? It's a reduction in our sources of knowledge. So
Yes.
here's 4 questions, all right? Or 4 statements. So I want you to take some time. We're going to give you a good bit of time here, maybe about 5 minutes. And I want you to identify what's being reduced in each one of these 3 statements, all right? I don't believe in God because science hasn't yet come up with an experiment to prove his existence. What's being reduced? Right and wrong are really just a product of where you grew up and who taught you, all right? And if God existed, he would show himself once and for all. All right, so take 5 minutes, right? And write down what's being reduced. Okay, we ready to go? Well, I'm going to say we're ready. All right. Whoops, I got to get back over here. Here we go. I don't believe in God because science hasn't yet come up with an experiment to prove his existence. What are we reducing here? Anybody? What are we reducing? We're reducing down to what?
To logic.
Maybe logic with reason, but it's not reasonable.
No. What's being reduced, right? What are they reducing here? You're right around it, but you're not quite there.
Are they reducing our experiences?
Something that's not scientific. I mean, that spiritual can't be.
Reducing science?
Yeah, they're reducing down to science. What's being reduced is knowledge down to science. What they're saying is knowledge only consists of science, what science can currently prove, right? So it's a reduction in knowledge and ways to know. This is also called scientism, as I mentioned before, right? It's good to have that vocabulary term in your back pocket because the church has nothing against science. In fact, the modern scientific method is actually directly traceable to a Christian worldview. There's nothing wrong with science. The only time it becomes problematic is when science turns into scientism. In other words, when I reduce all knowledge down to just the scientific, it's as many modern, and this is the way many modern atheistic texts do, and they tend to boil everything down to that, down to science, okay? So they're eliminating 2 of the ways that we know things, all right? Just be aware of that. As soon as someone says science, they just eliminated 2 ways of knowing, all right? Here's our second question. Right and wrong are really just a product of where you grew up and who taught you, right? What's being reduced here? It's a little trickier. What's being reduced here? Come on, looking for one brave person. So what are we talking about?
We're talking about experience.
No. What's this statement talking about?
Right or wrong, which is
morality, right? Okay. Right?
You can't reduce that.
Yeah, so it's reducing morality down to what?
To experience?
To your environment. To your environment, right?
Which is your experience in your environment, right? Okay.
Right. But it's reducing morality down to environment, right? I mean, you hear this from people. Sometimes people say something like morality, right and wrong, depend on depend upon where you grew up and who taught you. So morality must be totally dependent on where you live and when you live. There's an element of truth to that, but there's a confusion that happens here, okay? C.S. Lewis, the great Christian writer, put it this way. In school, we learn two kinds of truths. We learn truths that are true no matter where you are, like math. Well, except nowadays that's even changing, but like math. And we learned truths that are true, but might be different, like the rules of baseball. In baseball, we run 3 bases, but it could have been 4. There's nothing saying it had to be 3. But the point is, there are always some things that are true because they're always true. And some things are true and they could change.
Mark,
yeah.
question.
Yeah.
How do you address the comment of we are a product of our environment? How does that relate?
That's the same. It's the same statement said different, stated differently, Tom. That's this exact same statement, right? We are not the total product of our environment, okay? Because again, back to this point, there are some truths that are true no matter where you grew up, no matter who raised you. And there are some truths that didn't have to be that way and they could change, right? So it's because we learn morality in school, right? Sometimes we assume that morality is one of those truths that can change, but it's not. You look at all of human history, you find a remarkable thing amongst all the cultures, that morality is actually very stable across time and space. Some things vary, but you'll never find a culture that actually values betrayal and abandoning your loved ones. Pretty hard to do, okay? Is that clear, Tom? Yes, no, maybe?
Yeah, if I could respond to get my speaker to work. Yes, no, I understand. That's perfect.
And that also leads a lot to my experience with, my grandson and others, is they're not taking ownership.
Yes.
Of their, so they're blaming everything on environment instead of taking moral responsibility for their own actions.
Well, yeah. So if I can divert for just a little bit, one of the greatest defects, and there are many, of critical race theory is this theory of oppressors and oppressed. But one of the side effects of that, and they're starting to see it now, is that it denies people have agency, which means they're basically stating people have no control over their fate, over their lives. And that's not true, right? And as people are just immersed in this theory that says you have no agency, they're finding people are just giving up, right? They're not trying anymore. And that's one of the greatest crimes behind critical race theory.
And isn't that reductionism also, in a way, because you're being reduced to something that is really not of your own control or your own being?
Well, what critical race is, reduces us to groups of people by oppressed and oppressors and oppressed, and by color of our skin, right? So it's actually a reduction away from our common human dignity. Okay? I'd be willing to make that argument any day. All right, here's the last one. If God existed, he should show himself once and for all. What are we reducing here? Come on, it's actually an easy one. It's the same as the first one, right? It's another version of the scientism argument, of the sense argument, right? The only way I'm going to believe God is if I see him. In other words, experiential. Forget about logic, forget about testimony, all right? And you'll hear this one a lot. So again, if someone says this to you, they're basically either denying or refusing to acknowledge the other two ways we know things. All right? Is everybody okay with that? Because here, I got this last one. This last one's pretty tough. Okay, I'm going to give you a couple minutes to read it and then say what's being reduced. All right? And what we have here is a quote from a famous but fortunately former atheist. Okay? Take your time, read this. All right? I'll give you about 2 minutes to think about what's being reduced here. So what you want to think about, what is this? This quote is reducing what to what?
Can you read it? Because I can't see the screen.
So you can't see it?
No.
All right. Man is the product of causes which had no provision for the end they were achieving. His origin, his growth, his hopes and fears, his loves and beliefs are but the outcome of accidental collisions of atoms. No fire, no intensity of thought and feeling can preserve the individual life beyond the grave. All the labor of the ages, all the devotion, all the inspiration, all the noonday brightness of human genius are destined to extinction in the vast death of the solar system. So thanks, Lynn, for making me read that depressing quote.
Well, it's okay because we don't believe it.
Okay. Okay. What's being reduced here?
Anything that has been thought, learned, taught, or passed on is being reduced to a mere happenstance.
That's very close. What's the very first word in the paragraph?
I thought it was life to death.
No. What's the very first word in the paragraph?
Man.
Aha. So the thing that's being reduced is humanity, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right? So to what is he reducing humanity to?
Death. Nothing.
Just to the body. He's reducing us down to just our body. What else do we have as humans?
Intellect.
We have a soul.
Spirit.
Yeah, soul.
Yeah. Right? So this is a very subtle form of reduction in the form of scientism. He's saying the human being is nothing more than what science says, and science says that the body is just human atoms and electrons. So that is all that you are. We are soulless creatures, right? Once you die, there's nothing else. It's reductionism in the human person, right? And it leads to all kinds of human tragedy, right? If we have no souls. Right? So here's a world. In a world ruled by scientism, what would become of the arts, literature, philosophy, and music? Would there be a place for love, compassion, empathy, mercy, or justice? Right? It is a world where we would be cut off from many of the different, I'm sorry, I didn't start my video here. It'd be a world where we would be cut off from many of the different sources of truth and therefore the fullest picture of reality. Look at this slide. And basically, this is what the scientism people would have you believe. There is no literature, there is no revelation, philosophy, art, or music. Did you know that even today, scientists do not know where a melody is stored in the human brain? Isn't that a fascinating fact? They're not even sure where images are stored in our brain, but they know it's there. But imagine this world where it's just math and science. It would be a very cold, cold place to live. And this is what we have to point out to the atheists, because I believe most atheists would not want to live in this kind of world without love, without compassion, or justice. Does it make sense? Oops, there we go. So whereas in the Christian worldview, it leads to the flourishing of the human person, and it is the fullest expression of the reality God created for humanity. The first person to discover the human soul with reason alone was Socrates. Now, there's some people that think you can prove the human soul with logic and philosophy. We can learn about the soul just like we did with God through all three different ways of knowing. We can use logic as Socrates did, and we can know it through revelation because God tells us he made us with a body and a soul, and we can experience the fact that we have a soul as well. The existence of our soul is just not a matter of faith. These things often come as a package deal. The belief in the soul comes along with the belief in God. And we get a little bit more into the belief of God, we can talk about how we know that the human being has a soul. All right. And that's it for my presentation right now until we get to part 2. And I can just open it up for any questions that you all have at this point. Once again, we left them speechless.
Thank you. It's so informative, really.
It is. It's pretty. It's a lot to unpack because it's pretty heavy. Do you have any recommendations on where we can get more information to be, to either get prepared for your class or to just kind of fill in some more of what you've taught today or be teaching?
We have handouts like we did last time, right?
True, yes. I'll send those to them.
You have electronic versions of all that?
Yeah, I can send them the handout for today. I forgot they didn't have that, and then the slides.
Yeah, so we have some supplemental materials that we can send to you that you can read, okay? And we'll get those out to you. And then those will help for the second class. And then Terry's class, which you'll do next week, right?
Yeah.
We'll build on this, and then I'll come back and do my part 2 in 2 weeks.
Yeah.
And follow up on other more specific ways that we can have these discussions with atheists. Yeah. The big thing today I want you to walk away with is how we know things, those 3 different ways, okay? And how to recognize reductionist arguments, okay? That's the big thing today. And so, if you think back on conversations you've had with family members who are atheists, or just friends in general, if you can remember the details of those conversations, I bet you'll recognize where they were using a reductionist argument and what was being reduced. Okay, so I think between now and the next class, if you just think about that, and you can go out on YouTube and look at some of the little videos that atheists put out and do a little practice and, ask yourself, what's this individual reducing, right?
That's good. That's a good suggestion.
Right, because that's great practice, is just listen to their arguments and say, what's being reduced here, okay? Because they're slick, they're persuasive, and most of all, they appeal to emotion, which so much today is driven by emotion and feelings rather than, objective facts and truths, okay? And then I would recommend going out there, and as I said before, Google or go on YouTube and look at Bishop Barron's debates he's had with atheists. because he does a fabulous job. Okay. And not only does he, you know, on the facts does a great job, but just in his whole pastoral approach to it. Right. So he would be a great individual to emulate in terms of how you go about having that discussion. Right. Now, granted, we're not all going to be Bishop Barron level of knowledge, right, in a couple of weeks, but it gives you an idea of what you can aspire to. Let's put it that way. All right.
And I want to say for next week, we're going to go through where we'll be able to distinguish by the end of the class what a Christian means by the word God and what we don't mean by the word God.
Yeah.
And that's a very big deal when you're talking to an atheist. And then we'll be able to use that information to answer some of their common objections about God's existence. So
yeah,
I found this very, very helpful.
Yeah. Yeah. So as we go along, you'll have more tools, right? And, you know, one of my favorite questions for someone who tells me they're atheist is, tell me why you want God to not exist.
That's a good one.
Why is it important to you that God not exist? Right? Because normally there's a little emotion attached to their statement, you know, or a level of certitude that would indicate they've given it some thought, right? Mm-hmm. And so they've already indicated it's important to them. So why is it important that God not exist, right? And then to Terry's point, and I think Terry's question is far better than that one, is tell me about the God you don't believe in, right?
Yeah.
And 9 times out of 10, they'll describe a God that we don't believe in either. Right?
And I think it's beautiful. You'll see God in a way. I learned to see God in a way that just was so amazing. From we're actually using. Do any of you listen to School of Faith's Rosary every day?
Yeah, I mean,
we're using their course on answering atheism by that Sebastian D'Amico put together. So when I first heard it, I was like, I heard all 4 parts. I was like, this is so good. And don't worry if you're not getting the concepts right now, because by the end of the 4 weeks, you'll have a lot of them probably, you know, planted in your heart pretty firmly. And you'll be able to start like using that more naturally. You know what I mean? Like, don't worry about today. Today's always overwhelming, the first talk.
Right.
It gets easier from here.
Yes. The core today is recognizing reductionism and the 3 ways of knowing. That's critical. You walk out of here with a pretty good grasp of that. The rest of this is going to make it just that much more clear to use. You'll be effective. Yes, Angie.
I find it interesting that what you said is true, because in my discussions I've seen it, it's all very emotional, which is something that doesn't fit into the reductionism. So it's funny how they use what they don't believe in, which is emotion and things that have to do that are not concrete, in order to fight the argument that it's.
Well, again, I get back to the importance of being pastoral as you engage in these discussions, because nobody enjoys being trapped in an inconsistency. Nobody likes being trapped in an illogical statement, right? Particularly where they attach some importance to it, right? I mean, just, you're tearing down a wall that they built, right? You're tearing down this edifice that they believe, right? And so when you go about doing that, there's going to be some emotion attached to that. It's just like if someone came up and attacked your Catholic faith, assuming the Catholic faith was illogical, right? How would you feel about that? Right? And the Catholic Church is under attack for, again, using some of the same methods. We'll just say that.
Well, and what you're saying is that one way that they explain it is trying to use logic and science, but the reason they're arguing about it is emotional.
Yeah, but also keep in mind, Teresa, it's also We don't share a common understanding of the terms used in the debate or the argument.
Oh, yeah.
So we use terms differently. And when I say argument, I'm saying argument in a classic sense, where there's an agreement on terms, there's premises, there's assumptions, right? And then there's logical conclusions, either false or true, right? That's
Right.
the classical argumentation formula. If we don't agree on terms, and I had someone come up to me after the last time we taught this class, and she took to heart that whole thing about the terms, and she was having a discussion with her son who was an atheist, and they couldn't agree on terms. They couldn't agree on basic under definition of terms being used in their discussion. Right? So they're at almost like an impasse because they couldn't agree on that. But it's so important. Otherwise, you're just talking past each other.
I was thinking too about how, Mark, you were talking about the testimony of others. Did you talk about Amazon reviews?
Yes, Amazon reviews.
Well, and even in scientism or science, when they're saying they believe this particular scientist's research,
Right.
they're really going on the testimony of that scientist because they didn't probably take the time to look at his research.
Yeah, they probably didn't read the entire paper, did they?
Yeah, so they don't realize that's kind of a self-refuting claim. They're actually believing the testimony of somebody else. So it's a matter of who do we believe more? And why do we choose to believe their viewpoint? There's something else that's at the heart of it,
Yeah.
you know?
I think it's kind of funny. This is a sort of contrarian view of things, but I think with this pandemic, I think science is starting to get a black eye because everyone's quoting the science. So maybe science won't be as exalted after we get through this thing.
Yeah.
You know, everybody's claiming science for their decisions. And I don't think it's, well, we'll see.
Yeah. God has a way of doing that.
Yeah. Any other questions about this?
We learn a way on how you start the conversation. If somebody brings it up to you, how
We're having a hard time hearing you, Angie.
is there a way that you set the ground rule in order to?
Well, so there aren't ground rules as much as if you start having this discussion with someone and they use words you know have specific meaning, then you can say, what do you mean by that word? Okay. And what you can do, and this really works well, it says, please help me understand what you mean by that word because I really want to understand what you're telling me. Right? And that tells the person you're now serious about what they have to say. And most reasonable people will agree that some words have some level of ambiguity attached to them, or there's different ways of understanding the word, right? So it demonstrates you care, it demonstrates you want to know, but then it gets you two on the same page. And if you disagree, right, then you can say, well, I have a different understanding of that word. And then you can talk about that. Okay? But now you're having a dialogue. Okay? So I really don't set ground rules as much as just recognize when a word's being used that can be understood in different ways. All right, so be clear on the terms being used.
Mark, earlier someone mentioned that their children were very science-based and were looking for scientific reason to justify God and religion. My whole career, I've used science as an engineer, and so I am also very science-oriented, and I like to see things that prove the existence. And the more I've studied the Bible and the prophets in their writings, there is so much that they have said that during their time was almost unbelievable. But over the centuries, we proved that what they said was actually true. And it took perhaps 1,000 years for people to actually come up with the scientific validation of that. And I see that throughout the whole Bible. And there's also someone, his name is Father Robert Spitzer,
Yep.
who was a physicist, I believe, before he became a priest. And he gives talks on a website. It's called the Magis Center, MAGIS. And he goes through all kinds of scientific proofs for the existence of God and creation. And it's a real good source for people that are looking for scientific proof. And like I mentioned before, he's talked about the Shroud of Turin and how, you know, the only way that it could have been produced is by God, because it would have taken so much energy to produce that image on that cloth that the methodology doesn't even exist today to be able to do that.
Yeah, it's like the Tilma, the Lady of Guadalupe, that little, what is it, made out of grass down in Mexico City. NASA did an analysis of that, and it's something that at the time was only expected to last a few years before it rotted, right? It's still in perfect condition, and the colors are floating above the grass. They're floating above the fabric, and nobody can explain it, right? So yeah, there's things like that. But the class I'm talking about in the fall is going to talk about the convergence of science and theology. And those two things are converging quickly based on discoveries in the last 20, 30 years in astrophysics, cosmology, paleontology. All those things are really starting to point towards God. And so, as a matter of fact, there was in the area of quantum physics, which I'm not going to profess to know, but there's some leading scientists out there who say when it's all said and done, there's a force out there they can't identify, but they believe that at the end of the day, they're going to find the entire universe is held together down to the smallest structure by wisdom, which is just a mind-boggling statement from a scientist. That wisdom is the force that holds it all together. So it's some mind-boggling stuff out there. All right, so we got anything else? All right. Well, everyone, thank you.
All right, thank you, Mark.
And I'll leave you with a quick blessing. May Almighty God bless you, protect you, and bring you unto everlasting life. Amen.
Amen.
Go in peace. Have a great day.
You too.
Thanks, Mark.
Thanks.